Ladies and gentlemen, the sound you hear is a buzzsaw ripping through a painting of George Washington chopping down cherry trees. It's time for Professor Buzzkill, busting myths and taking names.
That's right. Busting myths, taking names. That's what I do for a living. It's the old professor here once again. You know, it's Thanksgiving season here in the United States, and the response to our episode about Thanksgiving last year was great. And many of you asked for a repeat this year. And rather than just run an encore presentation of that episode, I thought I'd expand on some of the myths and misconceptions about our American Thanksgiving that we've talked about before. Overall, and generally speaking, Thanksgiving is like almost all other holidays. The way it's celebrated and the history, and I'm putting history in air quotes there, that everyone, time for more air quotes here, knows about it, the history that everyone knows about it is half fact and half myth. Let's start at the beginnings. When and where was the first American Thanksgiving observance and feast held? And who was there? The traditional story is that Pilgrims at Plymouth, Massachusetts were so grateful for their survival in the New World and for a bountiful harvest that they organized a day of Thanksgiving prayer and feasting in 1621. The Pilgrims were thankful because their new lives were so much better, so the story goes, that they invited local Native Americans to join the feast, and it was a joyous event of cross-cultural understanding and friendship. But immediately, Buzzkillers, we've got problems. Not only does the Plymouth story rest on shaky evidence, there are plenty of other places in colonial North America that have claims to the first Thanksgiving observance. These include St. Augustine in Florida in 1565, San Elizario in Texas in 1598, and the Berkeley Plantation on the James River in Virginia in 1619. Days of Thanksgiving, however, have been observed in Europe for centuries before this. Sometimes, usually when an important and unexpected good event happened, clerics and clergymen would announce a day of Thanksgiving, and I'm using a small t in this instance, where they held extra masses and Thanksgiving prayers were said, literally giving thanks for surviving a terrible storm, winning a war, or something of that magnitude. So the idea of Thanksgiving observances is a very old one. But what's different about Thanksgiving in contemporary North America, and here I'm using Thanksgiving with a capital T, is that it has been given an official date or an official time to be observed and celebrated every year, rather than as an ad hoc practice that's used whenever something fortuitous happens. And of course, since we're talking about North America here, we have to include our Canadian Buzzkillers north of the border. It's only fair. Canadian Thanksgiving has been celebrated on the second Monday in October every year since 1957. Not 1557, 1657, 1957. Although an annual Thanksgiving has been established by the Canadian Parliament in 1879, the date of the observance wasn't fixed, and it moved depending on which Monday in October was the most convenient, depending on that year's calendar. So Canadian Thanksgiving has been, if you will, nailed down as the second Monday in October ever since 1957. Similarly, the official date of American Thanksgiving moved around quite a lot, but it eventually was set as the fourth Thursday of November. But that wasn't established until 1941. And the story of how Thanksgiving evolved in the United States is complicated and fascinating, especially how the government got involved in setting dates. So let's start telling that story. The legend of the Pilgrims at Plymouth in the 1600s is the dominant one, and it's the one that most Americans think is the origin of their Thanksgiving tradition. No mere one-day feast. The Pilgrims partied for 3 days after a particularly good harvest in 1621. It's pretty clear, however, that this was a harvest celebration, not really a Thanksgiving observance. The story of deliverance from the religious persecution in England, as well as deliverance from a harsh winter, doesn't sort of appear in any of the records we have about the first Thanksgiving. In other words, the Pilgrims weren't thanking God for some special act. They were having a harvest dinner in which they would thank God, but it was sort of, forgive the expression, run-of-the-mill. Harvest dinners, by the way, were a centuries-old tradition. Even in modern-day England, some people hold a harvest dinner every year in autumn. The accounts that survive tell us that roughly 50 Pilgrims and 90 Native Americans celebrated this 1621 harvest dinner. There's no direct evidence that the Pilgrims invited the Native Americans to the dinner, but since Squanto and other natives had helped the Pilgrims enormously during the early years of settlement, it's likely that when Native Americans came to the dinner, they were welcome. Venison was the main dish, and the only one that's mentioned in any of the available sources. They may have had turkey because that wasn't uncommon at the time, but it wasn't as frequently consumed as deer. In 1623, the Pilgrims did have a more religious Thanksgiving celebration. There had been a drought that year, which finally broke with a 14-day rain late in the summer, early in the fall. The subsequent harvest was abundant, and the Pilgrims had reason to have a harvest dinner and also make it a day of Thanksgiving from the drought. Days of Thanksgiving were usually proclaimed by presidents, but also sometimes by major clergymen, fairly regularly in the early decades of U.S. history. These Thanksgiving observations were usually for a specific event, such as the end of the War of 1812, and only sometimes they were brought about for a sort of general period of good fortune. Thanksgiving, therefore, was not a regularly scheduled holiday and was not necessarily observed every year, and the dates often varied from state to state. Then came the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln usually gets the credit for creating a national day of Thanksgiving, starting with an 1863 proclamation, prompted by the Union successes in the war, especially at the Battle of Gettysburg. But if that's not a myth, it's certainly an oversimplification. But we'll explain that myth after we hear from our sponsors. The real originator of what we recognize as Thanksgiving, and there I'm using the capital T, both in terms of when it should be held and what should be celebrated, was Sarah Hale, the editor of the prominent magazine Godey's Lady Book, and Sarah Hale lived in Boston. Somewhere she'd read about the 1621 Pilgrims' Thanksgiving, probably a highly romanticized version, and she thought that Thanksgiving should be celebrated as a national holiday. So starting in 1846 Buzzkillers, 15 years before the Civil War, she wrote to Presidents Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and finally, Abraham Lincoln. The combination of Hale's ideas and Lincoln's desire and need, frankly, to give the country an emotional lift during the Civil War spurred Lincoln's 1863 Thanksgiving Proclamation, which declared that the holiday was to be celebrated on the final Thursday of November each year. Annual observances started in 1863 and have continued since then. Thanksgiving practices, however, remained diverse for almost a century. People ate duck, geese, chicken, and sometimes turkey. Sometimes games and sports were played, and sometimes parades were held. Now, let's fast forward to 1939, to another president who's given credit for modern Thanksgiving. In 1939, with the Depression still going on, President Franklin Roosevelt decreed that Thanksgiving was to be observed on the next to last Thursday of November each year. Apparently, although the sources are not absolutely clear on this, he did it in order to jumpstart the Christmas shopping season and boost holiday sales. Thanksgiving by this time had marked the start of Christmas shopping, and of course we know that so well in our fall and winter daily lives. There was considerable opposition to this, however, to Roosevelt's monkeying around with the date. Some Republicans and others thought it was wrong to mess with tradition. So Congress finally stepped in and passed a joint resolution saying that starting in 1942, Thanksgiving would be observed on the fourth Thursday of November. That stuck. So although the 1621 Pilgrim story is what we think about and we will often talk about and what's often taught in schools, it took a lot of other people and events to bring about modern Thanksgiving. Sarah Hale, the Civil War, Abe Lincoln, the Depression, FDR, and Congress. And when you throw in the traditional football games, the Macy's Day Parade, and the presidential turkey pardoning, it means there have been a lot of cooks creating Thanksgiving in the United States. What we're going to need at the Institute Thanksgiving Feast this year, Buzzkillers, is not more cooks, but more doctors. Lady Buzzkill had to call in specialists to resuscitate me from my food coma last year. it was touch and go. But I've been assured that the Institute has brought doctors and nurses onto the payroll this month, and I should be in good hands. So we can all look forward to at least another year of busting myths and taking names. Gobble, gobble, Buzzkillers. Talk to you next week.